You didn't choose to get upset. It just happened. One sentence and suddenly your entire state shifted. Most people blame the person or the situation, but that's not where it actually happens. It happens in a split second before the reaction, where something gets in. And once you see what's really happening there, no one can trigger you the same way again. Part 1. The weight of attachment. Most people go through their days carrying things they don't realize they're carrying. The need to be liked, the need to be right, the need to feel like things are going the way they're supposed to go. And for a while it works, until someone says the wrong thing, or something doesn't go the way it should, and suddenly all of that weight crashes down at once. Buddhism has a word for this kind of clinging, upadana. It's not about possessing things, it's more subtle than that. It's the way the mind latches onto how things should be, onto approval, onto comfort, onto a version of yourself that has to be protected and defended at all costs. That grip is the thing that makes you vulnerable, not the people around you, not the circumstances, the grip itself. What the tradition points to is something different, not indifference. Not pulling back from the people and things that matter to you. It's more like showing up without conditions. You care, but not in a way that requires a specific outcome. You love without needing the love returned in the exact shape you want. You engage without making your peace contingent on how everything turns out. That shift changes something. When someone says something harsh, you notice it, but it doesn't knock you over the way it used to. Not because you've shut yourself off, but because you no longer need them to speak kindly in order to feel okay. Think about what it would feel like to stop renting your sense of stability out to other people's behavior, to stop needing the situation to cooperate before you can settle into yourself. That's not coldness. That's a different kind of grounding. Your center stays where it is, whether the person in front of you is praising you or tearing you down. Their words reveal something about them. They don't define you. That's the thing people confuse about detachment. They think it means not caring. But the people who have truly practiced it, they often care more deeply. They just aren't undone by outcomes. And because they aren't undone, they can stay present. They can keep showing up. The rope isn't cut. It's just loosened enough to breathe. Part 2. Watching without being pulled in. There's a difference between experiencing something and being taken over by it. Most people don't notice that distinction, not in the moment anyway. Someone comes in hot, and the heat moves into you, and suddenly you're running the same temperature they are. You didn't choose to catch it. It just transferred. What mindfulness practice, Vipassana especially, trains you to do is create some distance between what's happening and what you do with it. The same way a still lake gets disturbed when something drops into it but then returns to stillness. The ripple passes. The water settles. It was never not water. You can watch anger moving through someone else without letting it move through you. You can feel the sting of an unfair criticism without becoming that sting. There's a version of you that's observing all of this thoughts, feelings, reactions that is steadier than any of it. It doesn't disappear when things get loud. It just gets harder to access. That's the skill, pulling back to the observer position even when the pull to react is strong. And it starts with something simple, noticing that you're not your thoughts. You're the one who notices them. There's a gap there, small but real, between the thought that arises and what you do next. If someone offers you something burning hot and you don't reach for it, you don't get burned. The heat stays with them. That's what it means to observe without absorbing. You're not a passive surface that everything sticks to. You can let things move past. It doesn't make you cold, it makes you free. Part 3. What lives in the space before response? Before the argument, before the thing you'll regret saying, before the whole thing escalates, there's a moment. It's brief. Most people blow right through it without knowing it was there. That moment, small as it is where choice lives. The automatic reaction happens fast. Someone cuts you off and the anger is already there before you've finished processing what happened. That speed is part of how we're wired, but the first emotion isn't you. The first emotion is a signal. What you do with it, that's yours. Training yourself to notice that gap and then widen it, even slightly, that's where meditation does its quiet work. You sit, you watch your breath. Something arises, a sensation, a thought, the urge to follow a distraction, and you don't. You pause. Over time, that muscle gets stronger. It gets easier to find the pause in ordinary life, not just on a cushion. When you can pause before responding, you start saying things you actually mean. You stop adding kindling to fires that were already dying on their own. You find that most moments don't require the reaction you were about to give them. The pause didn't just prevent damage. It gave you a second to see clearly. And from clarity, what comes out is usually different, quieter, less combative, more considered. That's not weakness. That's a different kind of strength. Slow to ignite, hard to push off center. Part 4. Refusing to add fuel. When someone brings anger into the room, the instinct is to match it, to defend, to counter, to prove something. And sometimes that happens before you've even decided. The body responds. The words are already out. But fire needs oxygen. It needs feeding. And one of the stranger, more counterintuitive things in Buddhist thinking is this. You can simply not feed it. You can be present, you can be still, and the fire will burn itself out. Not because you've suppressed anything, not because you're performing patience, but because you've genuinely decided your peace is worth more than the argument. That the person in front of you, whatever they're doing, is working through something that was already happening inside them before you walked in. Their anger isn't really yours. You don't have to carry it. When you stay quiet in those moments, not to be difficult, but because you genuinely have nothing to prove, something strange happens. The other person often runs out of steam. They were prepared for a fight. They don't have a script for stillness. That's not manipulation. It's just refusing to enter a game that was never going to end well. Part 5. What silence actually says. Silence gets misread. People assume it means you have nothing to say, or that you're backing down, or that you didn't notice. But there's a kind of silence that communicates something much more clearly than words. It says, I'm not moved by this. I see what's happening and I'm choosing not to go there. In the Dhammapada, the idea comes up that a single word spoken with meaning carries more weight than 1,000 spoken without thought. And sometimes even that one word isn't necessary. When you stop talking from the ego, the part that needs to win, needs to be heard, needs to defend, you stop leaking energy. That constant explaining, justifying, responding, it drains something. And once you notice how drained it leaves you, the quiet starts to feel like relief. Silence isn't passive. Inside a silence that's chosen rather than forced, there's actually a lot happening. You're observing. You're seeing the shape of the situation without being inside it. When you do eventually speak, if you do, it lands differently. It comes from somewhere steadier. The Buddha often sat without answering, not because the question was unworthy, but because sometimes a question asked in provocation can only be prolonged by responding to it. Silence dissolves it. And there's an inner version of this too. The mental noise, the looping thoughts, the self-criticism, the rehearsed conversations, that's a kind of noise as well. Real silence is when even that quiets, when the observer inside you stops being crowded out, when you can just be here without needing the moment to be narrated or justified or judged. Part 6. Stopping the fight with reality. Suffering, in Buddhist understanding, rarely comes straight from events. It comes from the story we build around events. From the part of us that insists things should be different from how they are. We feel the pain of what happened. And then we feel a second pain, the pain of resistance. The anger at the anger, the grief over the grief, the argument with the fact. That second layer is optional. It doesn't feel optional, but it is. Acceptance isn't about approving of what's happened. Someone can treat you badly. A loss can be real and devastating. The unfairness can be genuine. And you can still accept the reality of it without deciding the acceptance means nothing was wrong. It just means you stop pouring energy into the argument with what already is. Think of standing in the rain. The rain doesn't change because you're upset about it. You're still standing in it either way. The only thing that shifts is whether you're also fighting your own mind the whole time. This applies to people too. You can't reach inside someone and change how they're wired. You can set limits with how they're allowed to treat you. You can choose how much proximity you allow. But trying to control their character with frustration or willpower, that cost is yours to carry. Acceptance isn't surrender. It's seeing people clearly enough to stop expecting them to be what they're not. And with yourself, especially with yourself, there's something quietly powerful about turning toward what's uncomfortable instead of away from it. Pain that's looked at directly tends to soften. Pain that's avoided tends to accumulate. Part 7. The direction of attention over time. There's a concept in Buddhist practice called bhavana, the cultivation and training of the mind. Not a dramatic transformation, something quieter than that. Small, repeated shifts of attention that compound over time, every time you return to the breath. Every time you choose observation over reaction. Every time you stay with what's uncomfortable instead of reaching for distraction. None of it seems like much in the moment. But over time, something in you changes shape. Not because you forced it, because you kept showing up for it. A drop of water on the same stone every day doesn't seem to do anything. Then one day the stone is different. The scattered mind, the one jumping between old regrets and future worries, between what someone said 3 days ago and what might happen next week. That mind is exhausted all the time. Not because life is unusually hard, but because its energy is going everywhere at once. Focused attention feels different. Not because everything is perfect, but because you're actually here in what's happening instead of perpetually somewhere else. You don't have to get it right every time. You don't have to be a perfect practitioner to feel this. The practice is in the returning. You drift, you come back. You drift further, you come back again. Every time you come back, something gets reinforced. The path gets a little more worn. Returning gets a little easier. Over time, not all at once, and not without setbacks, you start to notice that the things that used to throw you off center don't quite reach you the same way. Not because you've made yourself numb, but because you've built something inside that wasn't there before. Steadiness, not the absence of feeling, just less being dragged around by it. People may still try to push. Life will still hand you difficult things, but the ground under you feels different now, more stable. You observe what's happening. You understand something about it. And you stay mostly where you are. That's not some distant, idealized state. It's available here in this ordinary moment. And it doesn't ask for perfection, just attention. Just this breath, and then the next one.